Ladies and gentlemen, today we're going to be talking about performance vehicle gas mileage, and we're going to be going through some vehicles that do actually give you decent fuel mileage at relatively low to high speeds on the highway. And we're also going to be talking about what are some key factors of fuel consumption when discussing performance vehicles, and what should you look out, and if purchasing a alternative vehicle, not necessarily a performance vehicle, might actually be beneficial for fuel mileage at high speeds. So today we're going to have two different approaches. We're going to look at performance vehicles and fuel mileage in a theoretical manner, which will have to do with air resistance, RPMs, and fuel efficiency. And then we'll be looking at some practical things that you can do, or even practical variables that will actually change that, like gas type, octane, and other things like that. Then we're going to look at some examples of cars that fit these categories of decent performance vehicles at relatively good fuel mileages. But to start off, why buy a performance vehicle specifically for highway driving? Well, the reality of it is based off of wind resistance and RPMs. And this is kind of where I started thinking about it. The reality is that most performance vehicles, or a lot of performance vehicles, are sleeker and have less resistance, wind resistance, than most regular vehicles. So if you take, for instance, a wagon versus a Corvette, the Corvette will have a better wind resistance, and so it can easily or more easily get better fuel mileages. And that has to do with the engine. So the engine is obviously pushing the car, and the engine uses torque to allow the car to keep its speed. It uses the horsepower. Horsepower is basically allows it to accelerate, but the torque is what really determines if you're going to keep your speed or you're going to drop your speed. And that's just because it's pushing the weight of your car in a forward direction. So a car that is basically having decent fuel mileage in practical terms is when they have a low wind resistance and they don't have to push their engine very hard. And the wind resistance part is relatively negligible in terms of when you're selecting the vehicle. Like I said, we know that the Corvette is going to be very good, but we also know that there's regulation that does not allow the Corvette to have much better wind resistance than, for instance, a Camaro or a Mercedes. And so that's a bit negligible. So the part that you can actually do something about is the engine. So you need to find a car that has a lot of torque way down low, and that basically has very long gears, so that you may be able to have decent fuel mileage at very high speeds. That's the whole point of this, right? And I've said Corvette multiple times. That's because the Corvette is probably one of those competitors. Buying a C5 Corvette with the 5.7 V8, that V8 is not necessarily the most fuel efficient, and yet it can easily get over 30 miles per gallon at 90 miles per hour. And that is extremely impressive for the sake of this video. Now keep in mind, a Corolla or a Civic of around that same period of time will actually give you less miles per gallon at those speeds. And that's where the performance vehicles actually become a pretty decent bang for buck. Now, should you get a newer Corvette, will that make any difference? The reality is that the wind resistance hasn't really changed, and although we do have better technologies for the engines to run leaner and to use less gas, it won't necessarily change the figures very much at the speeds that we're talking about, because we know that these improvements give a 20% increase in fuel mileage at 60 miles per hour, but at 90 miles per hour, these figures are closer to 5%, which to some people might matter. To others, maybe the price of the C5 may outweigh the extra consumption of fuel. Another bargain example of a performance vehicle the Mercedes CLK 55 AMG with the 5.4 liter V8 has an average of 28 miles per gallon at 90 miles an hour, and that's doing 2,500 to 2,800 RPMs on the cruising range. That means that driving on the highway, this car is a total bargain for the gas mileage you may get. And once you go in the back roads and you decide to push on the throttle, you might find yourself having more fun than the regular Corolla owner. A C300 with a 7G Tronic got over 37 miles per gallon at around 90, which just shows that the higher gears and the long gear ratio transmissions that we have these days on these higher torque figure cars do actually get better gas mileage over these lower displacement Corollas and Civics. Now, if you didn't know, forced injection can strongly reduce miles per gallon. So if we look at, for instance, the Camaro ZL1, which is a car that I personally have close to my heart, it still only gets 25 miles per gallon at 80 miles an hour, which is about the same as the Corolla, although of course it is pushing a lot more horsepower. And that's just because superchargers push air into the induction, which generates more gas that goes into the cylinders. And especially for these kinds of supercharger, roots-based superchargers, they cannot be deactivated. So if we take a look at centrifugal superchargers, where they kind of function like turbos, these ones can actually be deactivated, and so those ones are more preferable for fuel mileage reasons. Now, I don't know any car that actually uses this, but it could be useful if you were to build a car and you wanted best fuel mileage. Turbos, on the other hand, also cannot be entirely deactivated from the path of the engine, and so those ones will kind of work similar to roots or twin scroll superchargers, in the sense that they will always either give horsepower through the intake and then use more gas, or they will actually take horsepower from the car when they're not activated. So now let's talk about the ugly truth about these cars, and that's when you get to the gas station. Because it is true that in a Corolla you will be wasting a little bit more gas per mile than, say, even a ZL1, but more specifically maybe like a CLK55. But once you get to the gas station, it is very possible that your performance car will have to be using 91 octane, versus the Corolla will only have to use 87. And so there's going to be a huge price difference per gallon. Currently, where I reside, the price of gas is extremely expensive, and it can go up to $2 per liter. Not per gallon, per liter. So the price of my tank of gas could be $133 or $135 over the Corolla's $90. And although I will have to just do one trip for my tank of gas, it'll still cost me more in the end, over 30%. However, there are ways to mitigate this. And I think the big learning moment that I had with performance vehicles is that most of them actually can be ran like trucks. And what that means is that although we have all these kinds of issues with gas, it has always been an issue for truckers. And so the things that truckers do to mitigate these prices is exactly what I should do if I do buy a performance car. And the number one thing I would say is to invest in ethanol. Now, E85 is not a new technology. It is a gas that has existed for over my lifespan, but it has gained a lot more popularity, especially in the sport forums, for the fact that you can make it yourself, and also the fact that it contains a lot more energy. It is a lot more energy dense than regular gas, or even high supreme gas. So it also has the added benefit of it costing relatively cheap, given that you have the supply of feedstock that you might need, which is soybeans, wheat, etc., and that you have the equipment that you need for the production of E85. Now that is the hard part. How do you produce E85, especially in large quantities? And the reality is that we're a little far away from still being able to produce this E85 at home in a reliable manner. We're currently at the point where making these distilleries for E85 become a moonshine experiment more than a reliable way of creating generators. And that's totally fine because we know that in the future, this will be a lot more accessible to everyone else. And the more that we work on them, the more other people will be able to build them. I do wish someday that I will be able to have my own gas stations that will sell E85 at a slightly elevated price so that I can make a small profit. But at this point, I think that it is worth talking about this solution. There is currently on this market only one E85 generator seller, which is Microfueler or eFuel is his company. And the reality is that his product is very expensive, and I've not been able to see anyone that can sell it. It does seem as though it's kind of a pyramid scheme. He does also sell a couple other things that seem like snake oil to me, so I wouldn't trust him. I would definitely go the home brewery route. Now, what exactly is the advantage of building your own distillery and getting your own E85? Well, the initial price of the distillery can be quite expensive, from $3,000 all the way up to $10,000, and the production of ethanol can be relatively small. But since we know that the amount of pound of corn per gallon for E85 is around 26 pounds of corn per gallon, we can do some quick maths to determine that it takes around 500 pounds of corn to fill up a Camaro ZL1. So in that case, is it worth buying that corn? Keep in mind it can be any corn. It doesn't have to be sweet corn or anything like that. Not high quality corn. Is it worth buying all that corn, producing the product inside the distillery and then putting it in your car? I think that overall it can be worth it. But you do need to purchase quite a large, potentially moonshine-esque distillery at home. And the entire deal is not necessarily legal, depending on where you live. Now, in my region, you can't necessarily get E85 as a delivery service, but in a lot of regions in the US and in some larger cities in Canada, you can easily get E85, E99, or even E98, depending on who you are, for very, very cheap. Here in the Greater Toronto area, you can get a 30-gallon drum filled up every day of the week if you wanted to, but every time you fill it up, it will cost you $250 for 30 gallons. Now, that is negligibly cheaper than regular 91 or 94 octane, which is not necessarily worth it, but when you do look at the performance and the fuel efficiency that you get using E85, you see that it is kind of worth it. So buying a distillery might be worth it in the long run. And considering that 500 pounds of corn at pennies per the pound, it can cost you a lot cheaper to distill your own gas, and you will probably make up your money in 1 or 2 years' time. With a distillery, you can also sell the E85 to your friends, family, and other people, which will give you your money back in a more direct way. Of course, you cannot put E85 in your car without having Bosch Flex Fuel injectors, and of course you want to have a special E85 tune. Potentially you want to put 30% E85, 70% gas, or a mixture that is even more E85 in it so that you can have those gains. And I only really suggest it if you have performance gains with your vehicle. For instance, rotary engines don't really have any performance gains with E85, which means that your only real advantage is relative price. Anyways, guys, this is kind of an overview of fuel consumption for performance vehicles. You clearly see that there are some advantages and disadvantages with every vehicle, and of course, in the near future, it will be more advantageous to get performance fuel over, homegrown performance fuel, should I say, over the regular fuel. Time will tell exactly what is worth. For now, buy your Cobalt SS's, buy your Corollas, buy your Dodge Challengers, and we will see who is happiest.